you're gonna get free this time. Falling into a blue sky mind. Came to me in that
Hello.
song, my friend.
Guess what time it is? It's time to tiptoe into the elephant with Deb Air. And I know we're waiting to hear that other voice say crystal clear. Today, it is moi, it is all of you, and it is the elephant. And even though you're not going to hear Crystal's voice today, be assured that she is here. I can feel her even now, can't you? It actually reminds me of just yesterday. I had a client come in and he sat down, and it was an unusual time for him. And I hadn't seen him in a while. And I was like, oh my goodness, I didn't even see that he was even on the schedule. So I was also pleasantly surprised. And I walk up to the table and I said, hey, like, different time. I was surprised. And he said, it's Crystal. And I said, what do you mean it's Crystal? Now you could understand, we always say this, but Crystal lives in Virginia and we're in New Hampshire. And he said, it was Crystal. This is why I'm here. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, I was in my car and he recently made a big change and has been at his new position at his job for about a month. And he was frustrated, and it was in relationship to navigating this position. And he was either texting and then he got in his car to take off, and he's perseverating about whatever he's perseverating about, as we do. And the phone flips out of his hand as he's frustrated, flips out of his hand, lands on the floor of the car. And all of a sudden, a moment later, he hears Crystal's voice say, it's only been 1 month. I was like, what are you talking about? Now, what's funny is I completely remember the 1 month conversation we were having. I think it was the Power versus Force episode, which is a great one if you haven't heard it, because we talk about the middle space and the rapport, that when we're in moments where we're feeling frustrated or we feel like we got to force or push our way through, and that difference between having to force and actually meeting the rapport of the moment and being able to receive the power that life gives to us in that moment. So here he is, 1 month into this job. Now, mind you, he does not have the podcast on. He doesn't have Spotify open. He doesn't have our website open. He has a completely different app open, and the phone flips out of his hand. And what had happened is it magically, and this is such an example of the magic of the gap. And you're going to hear me continually talk about gap magic. There will be a methodology and a program that will begin to divulge here as time goes on. The power of this is such an example of it. Here's a person who is in a moment that seems completely unrelated to. Crystal was talking about her son at the time and how he was playing football for 1 month and he was feeling frustrated that he wasn't doing as well. And here's this gentleman completely in another experience of life, much older than this child, right? In his work life. And all he hears is in the right moment. So what had happened, we believe, is that it opened his email, clicked the link, that the email had our link to this episode, and somehow landed on that exact part in our conversation in the Power versus Force episode, where literally it changed him immediately. This is the quantum moment where you cannot explain linearly, logically, Newtonianly, in a way that says this makes sense, but it's unequivocally true that this happened. He just needed to hear that one line where he remembered It's only been 1 month, and it completely changed his perspective. It was a moment where everything just lands. So Crystal is here. Whether you think you're not, your phone might flip out of your hand one day, and there will be Crystal. It comes in all different shapes, forms, times, unexpected moments. I feel like there's so many quantum stories I could tell you right now, but I'm going to pull back the reins and focus on today in the very classical way has definitely been an experiential thrusting forward of conversation because of, well, from my experience that I've been having, but also really what people have been sharing. So, how can mud change your life? We're in a circle. You don't have to answer, but we're just going to pose the question. It's like putting it in the circle right now. How can mud change your life? I'm going to start by sharing a story that happened this Sunday. I have recently fallen in love with paddleboarding, and it was a beautiful, beautiful Sunday afternoon here. And I was like, I just want to be out on the water. And I pretty much use the paddleboard as a glorified floaty. It's not like I'm going to go get a big workout in. It's an incredible gap zen moment for me. And I was going to go by myself. And on this day, for whatever reason, one of my dogs, Valentine, when he is absolutely like, it's a hell no, you're not leaving without me, he will literally stand in front of me, in front of the door. He doesn't do it all the time. But this moment he did. And I always know, we know that, right? When someone's like, oh, this is the different time. This is the time where I can't say no. So I was like, all right, y'all are going. So I brought my pups. They're small. So it's pretty easy to get them on the board. One of the things I've been doing, I've been curious about going to different places. I live by the water, I'm blessed to say. So my son's girlfriend was like, oh, you can go out by our place. And so I was like, perfect. I'll go to a new place. The weather is beautiful. It's a Disney afternoon. So she drives me to this location. And like I said, it's new. So I've had to learn, like those of you that go on the water, it's a whole different world. If you want to practice doing that, like get out on the water, it completely takes you out of all the things that living on the land you're used to, all the landmarks. I don't even just mean geographically, but that we just get so habitual in our everyday and what we expect, which ways we drive or whatever. So being on the water for me has been this beautiful, novel experience where I'm in the town I live, but I'm having a completely different perception and what the energy of my town is and offers. So I go out in this place. I'm looking at the landmark because I know that I can just sort of float away and go, wait, where am I? And it's, like I said, beautiful day. We're floating out, checking out new little pockets. The birds are amazing. We've got gray herons. We've got, what are those, like sandpipers? We've got cormorants. We've got seagulls, even crows. It was just like an extra birdie day. And I'm circling back, and you have to be aware of the currents because sometimes if you go out one way, if you're out for a while and you come back that way, the tide could have gone out and you may be in sand. And this was a new location, and I honestly was not even thinking about that. And I try to pay attention because I've come close to getting stuck before, but I can get around it. So I'm coming back and I start seeing the shallow area. So I start maneuvering away because my goal, my desire was to flow and move forward and still be in my very heightened ecstatic state and relaxed and very peaceful state. It starts getting shallow. I'm trying to move around it. And I'm realizing, like, oh, there's no way to move around it. And by the time I realized that, I was a good amount in to shallow water. And it was like, oh God, I'm going to have to backtrack here. But in that time, the water's going out even more. So basically, I am stuck in the mud. And I have been in touch with this mud before. And I know that it's very sinky, meaning like if you put your foot in, you don't stop, you keep going. It's a bit like quicksand. So I didn't want to get off. Now I also have the dogs. And suddenly, this very beautiful moment, have you ever had that where you're like, the birds are chirping literally, and all this is just wonderful. And I'm just so grateful that I took this moment to just be in the presence of the beauty and nature of life. And all of a sudden, it's like, there's the mud. And I went through this whole process, which I won't go moment to moment, but I basically went through these evolutionary pieces of denial, complete denial. It's like, no, 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 no. You're not going to fuck with my peace. So I'm just going to pretend this isn't happening. I'm just going to float. And I know I'm going to be able to get out of the mud really easily. Well, I couldn't. And I started just with one foot off. And then, of course, now the dogs, they're seeing that it's ground and they seem okay on the paddleboard, but it's still new to them. So I think they still like land more than floating on the paddleboard. So they're now seeing the ground. And so they're like, oh my God, I can go off. I'm free. And so I'm commanding them to stay when we get nervous, especially our kids or animals or. And it's so easy to go from Zen moments to freak out moments. And someone was just saying that to me, like, it's crazy how you can go from 0 to 100. And I'm wondering if you've had these experiences where everything's going your way and then it's not. And that's when we feel like the universe is conspiring against me, or, I can't catch a break, especially when there's waves of that. So my experience during this mud adventure was actually so many things. I went, like I said, I started with denial. Now, what was crazy, the lighting was beautiful. The reflections of the time of day it was in the afternoon as the sun was starting to drop a little bit, the way the sun reflected the clouds in the water. And there was more birds at that time because when it gets shallow, they all come and eat all the delicious things that they eat. And so they are happy. So you have this juxtaposition of happy, 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 beautiful, beautiful all around you. But I was in a state that I didn't want to be in. So I immediately had denial. I immediately wanted to pull out of the beauty, and yet I couldn't move out unless I stepped in. And I'll tell you, and what I'm saying really is that until I stepped into the moment. Denial is this moment where we go, I don't know why I'm feeling emotion about this, is that it's like we say this can't be happening. And here's the other thing. I was all alone. There were no boats. There were no freaking humans. And I wasn't like I was in an area that was super secluded. It could have been quite possible that I would bump into some other human. But no people around, just the birds having a field day and me having to come to the reality that I had to step into the moment. And what that meant for me is literally stepping off my board and going knee deep in mud with both feet. And there was also this part where I had to trust, is it safe to put my feet in? It doesn't sound scary, the mud, but what could happen? And there is reality that there's sharp shells. And so I had to step into it and trust that this was the only way. It's the only way I could see to meet the moment so that I could move forward. And so, I mean, it was crazy. I had to, because there's the fins on the board and they were just sinking in the mud. And I had to close my eyes as I'm also having panic moments, yelling at the dogs, like, stay on the board. So I have tension in my voice. I have these moments of surrender. I have these moments of listening to the birds and the beauty. I still have these flits of denial that are like, no, this isn't happening. You stole my pleasure. Why is this happening? And yet I will say in this moment, there was so much surrendering for the most part. And it had a range of feeling. There's no question. And I think that range was necessary because we do go through these these ranges of when we hit a moment, when we hit the mud, whatever that is, and we go, well, that's not what I was expecting. And I was planning on going here, whether it's a feeling, whether it's a destination in my mind, physically, a goal, whatever it is. When all of a sudden we're stuck in the mud, it's not the way we were planning on it to be. And the whole process, I mean, it took me a while to get out of the mud. And my one dog was all excited. He thought this was exciting and he was getting turned on by it. I'll be honest. Those of you that have dogs that get excited about things, he was a little bit excited. And I was like, how are you? Like, it brought humor in the moment. So this happens. I get out of the mud. I have to go to shore in a completely different area. I mean, the whole thing, and get in the mud again, not as badly. Have to lug things. I've got the dogs. I mean, it looks like from the outside like a mess. And at the same time, it's like it could have been dangerous, right? I could have focused on, holy shit, I could get taken out to sea, or I could go. What happens when we're in complete denial and we go into a fight or flight without meeting the moment, without taking true inventory of what's happening? We will go into the scariest moments. We will go into the quote unquote worst case scenario. And that's one of the things I did when I got out of the mud. I just assessed it. I was like, the mud's not dangerous. And I was even playing with it. I'm like, this is like, you go to salons for this stuff. My feet, my legs are going to feel amazing. My skin's going to be so soft. I should be thanking the universe for this. I'm looking at these birds take off and eat the crabs, and the whole thing was quite beautiful. And so I get out of there and I'm amazed, I'm grateful, and I'm amazed. I was grateful, and I brag of the parts of me that just sank literally into the moment. And that when I did, there were gems at the center of that. It's like at the center of a seed, right? All that is life is within that seed, and it needs to be in this dark muck for it to crack open. And that brings me to, most of us have probably heard of Thich Nhat Hanh and in his famous phrase or mantra, no mud, no lotus. Funny enough, I love the lily lotuses that grow out here on the seacoast and straight from the mud. And I've always been fascinated by them. And I mean, the whole concept of no mud, no lotus is that by nature, in our humanity, in our human experience that we go through, that basically that suffering and transformation are intrinsically linked. And today I want to use the musing and exploration of evolution, of our evolution and nature, as a way to explore that connection. And I also want to consider that how our participation of observing what is by nature organic, by observing where we are in our evolution, and by choosing to engage and participate in our own evolution, can create a potential new paradigm of experience the mud, how we experience suffering, and how we can use moments of suffering in a way that doesn't have to mean that we have to go through suffering in order to transform. The reality is that if we look at history, you look at, let's say, 9/11 in the most recent history, at least of our country, 9/11 was devastating. 9/11 was a suffering moment on a pretty large scale. And I personally remember volunteering at Ground Zero and had a real visceral, real life experiencing of how beautiful and connected and transformative humanity got in that moment. And at funerals, I was just recently on an episode talking about being at a friend's funeral and how beautiful it was to see how much love and how much suffering can bring that up, like the lotus coming from the mud, like the butterfly coming out of the chrysalis, and the struggle of the chrysalis to from the caterpillar. So they are extrinsically linked by nature, right? We can look at a lotus and look deep, and it would always fascinate me. I'd peer in and see what is in there, and it's just dark and muddy. And these flowers, these lotus flowers, are thick and sturdy, and butterflies can fly and move, and they're free, and they get to just explore life. And so we don't deny by nature and our evolution that struggle can create expansion, can create transformation. And we also see it in a lot of our really profound leaders, Martin Luther King, or many people I could list, that often these people have had struggles or trauma in their past that have allowed them to overcome. So I think the first part is saying, yes, you know what? That is part of our nature, that they are intrinsically linked, meaning suffering or trauma of some kind and transformation, overcoming beyond that and becoming more, are by nature connected. And I also like to look at, well, do we have to go through suffering every time we want to make a change? Because that's not really the best marketing strategy for promoting personal growth. Look at our world. We can look at anxiety, mental health trends, like they are skyrocketing, suicide, depression. And it used to be, well, especially since the pandemic. But let me just say who I am in the center of gravity of the service that I provide for the world, and being an embodiment facilitator, for being a spiritual mentor, for being a personal growth coach, from being a doctor of chiropractic. It's always fascinated me to see what are the trends and the patterns of not just somebody that I'm talking to individually, but what are the collective patterns. And before the pandemic, all these things were on the rise. So I think it's important to look at that. What I'm looking at in our evolution is that we're not so good at being with the mud, meaning that anxiety, depression, suicide are all forms of overwhelm in which we have lost the capacity to be in the suffering, and that the suffering, the pain becomes the suffering. They say, what, and I don't know who first coined this, that pain is inevitable and suffering is optional. And I'm kind of exploring this a little bit differently today, because I think it's important to first acknowledge that these are intrinsically, that pain and or suffering are linked to our transformation. And we can see that in the proof of the trends that we are also, even though we know they're intrinsically linked, we also know that culturally speaking, we absolutely reroute, or we are overloaded in a way that we have a hard time being with the things that are hard, being with the parts that say life is going great, and then it blows the fuck up in your face and you go, what is going on? And is there a possibility where, a few episodes back, I was talking about micro doses of awe. I want to say it was on our celebration episode. And that how celebration was such an important piece, that it's very easy to kind of get stuck in this status quo, this very kind of neutralized place where things aren't too bad and they're not too good. So we don't rock the boat. Everything is okay. I'm surviving another day. And I think I still really promote that. And I love it. And I had many microdoses of joy and of awe in that paddleboard experience. There's also what I also had, which made me smile when it came into my brain is that I was also experiencing microdoses of mud or microdoses of suffering, meaning it wasn't a 9/11 moment. But there are these moments, literally, and literally, I was stuck in the mud, but these moments that felt uncomfortable. And as I sank into that and I came into that gap space, I was also simultaneously able to see the beauty that was right around me. I was also able to see that in that moment, I was safe. I was also able to see that there was a way to move forward, but that the way was the way into the present moment. Two pieces that I want to bring forward to go back to the evolution, that we're in this evolutionary moment where we are having a hard time in dealing with the mud of life. And it is pushing us into this fragmented, overwhelmed, high anxiety. I've been in practice for 30 years, and it used to be certainly people had anxiety, but anxiety has become so normalized because it is so prevalent. And it is a representation that this is a conversation that's important to have, because if we are overwhelmed, usually what happens is we do not pick up the microdose moments of life. And because we can't pick that up, we're listening to the world through a transistor radio, and we're just hearing not very specific information. It's just kind of white noise. But we need to be listening through a Bose stereo system where we can listen to the intricacies, the subtleties. And that's the only way that I feel we can transform. Right now, what I hear a lot of people say is that we go from 0 to 100. All of a sudden, it's like the tidal wave has to come in because we've lost the subtle awareness. So we need the big moments, right? You hear like the universe whispers, it whispers, and then it screams. And I think that we have been so conditioned to avoid discomfort either by self-medicating or medicating or therapeuting it all. And I'm not saying that any of these within their own right and their own moment have value and usage. Sure, absolutely. But I'm also looking at the reality of statistics and where are we at? And we kind of suck at microdoses of anything, microdoses of awe, microdoses of mud. And what happened with this whole experience of the paddleboarding is the next morning, and again, I rejoice in the fact that I was like, this was an adventure. And it felt like I went to some kind of spiritual retreat. The universe is like, Deb, you have no idea, but you are going to go through this moment. And I was grateful to have felt the parts of me that kind of busted open in ways that felt more patient, that felt a deeper listening, that felt a deeper gratitude. And within that, all of this clarity, all of these things that I have been working on, some of the methodology for gap magic that I just mentioned earlier, is starting to flow in effortlessly. I'm not going after it. It's like the power versus force. The power is coming to me, but it required these parts where I was probably unpresent to it, that I needed to sink into the mud. I needed to not just slow down, but be with the parts that felt comfortable, the parts that I hadn't planned on. And really, that was the plan all along, right? That is the thing that brought me into more clarity. The lotus, that's where the lotus comes in, and or the butterfly starts to fly. And I was on the next day after my paddleboard spiritual journey adventure, I was on the massage table, and I could all of a sudden, I just saw my body, and then my body just sort of slided off, slid it. I just said slided. Crystal, where are you? You're not laughing at my vocabulary. I hope everybody is. Slid off, and out came my light. It was like I was a light body. And then As I lay there, all of these geometrical shapes and circles started to kind of fall in, and I could see Venn diagrams and all these beautiful things that gave me clarity of some of the things that I have been wanting to have more clarity on in regard to some of the things that I'm wanting to create. And so this has just continued. I went to the gym with my moped and I got out of the gym and my moped wouldn't start. I went to go visit a friend and I took the wrong exit and was 10 or 11 miles before the next exit. All these things. There was other things that I can't even remember right now. The point is there were oh, and this was what's really cool. It's going to sound weird, but I almost tripped down the stairs today. And this is where I think microdoses of what I'm calling microdoses of mud, of suffering come in, is that all of these things were happening. And the question is, what if these microdoses of mud, meaning these little moments that we could pay attention to that don't go our way, what if they were just foreshadowing that something is ready to transform in you, that there's a pattern that's ready to shift, to change? There's this book called The Circle of Stones by Judith North. And basically, it's like a retrospective reboot or reorganization of how we could imagine our life to be. And a lot of the stories are about women who either are cancering or they're at a place of their life of suffering. And each chapter starts with an imagined story. And one of the ones that I can remember right now was, it said, what if when you were a young woman and you started your menstrual cycle, that your dad took you to pierce your ears or something that you wanted to do, and that your mom took you to a circle with wise women and all celebrated this moment? Like, what if this was part of the culture? That it wasn't something that you had to hide, that it wasn't something that you felt embarrassed of, that it wasn't something that you felt all yucky and bloated or dirty or whatever it was, that we could rewrite. And I often will say this to people: you wouldn't be apologizing because you're crying if one of the first things you learned when you were taught as a child that crying is an expression of life. It's a microdose of awe that's going to give you, within the middle of that mud is the gem of the wisdom. And if you were taught that from the very beginning, tears wouldn't be so hard to cry. And some of you may be going, I'm really good at crying. But in actuality, we also have what I guess I want to call it like cryptic crying, meaning we cry over the same things that we're actually not. So it's less about the crying, is my point. That if we were enculturated in new ways, we could rewrite what it looks like to be human, to be able to be in the range of celebrating microdoses of awe, of celebrating or being with microdoses of mud. How different would our nervous system be to have the capacity to listen, to have the ability to know that there's wisdom and value, that there's Salotus coming, and that we can start to track that and recognize it versus run the freak away in the opposite direction or avoid it or side eye the moment, right? What if, for the positive person, and I've definitely been tagged as the positive person, and where I often say I can put silver lining on shit. I remember, even as a facilitator, how quickly, if somebody shared their mud experience, just meaning a challenging experience, how quickly I would go to the solution, how quickly I would put the silver lining on for them, how quickly I would open the door for another perspective. And what I didn't realize initially is the parts that I was avoiding in myself, I would avoid when I was working with others. And that I judged the mud moments as weakness. I would never have said that, but this is like the confessional time, as you know, and you, me, and the elephant, of our humanity, of our humanness. And that I didn't realize until I started experiencing more mud in my life. And in the past, the mud had to be louder. The experience had to be much more grand for me to listen, much more grand for the change to happen. In 2001, I had a 3 alarm fire in my office. I already wanted to move out of that physical location, and it took a 3 alarm fire. Just like Crystal's voice magically turned on in the right moment and said the exact thing that this person wanted to hear or needed to hear, these things we think, what is a fire? How could you influence that? These are the gap moments. How can we participate in our own evolution in a way that we can take charge of that? For the negative person, the mud moments is going to be like, the shit's always happening to me. It's like, no matter what I do, I can't come out ahead. And it feels like it's never going to end. And the reality is, we all have those places. The thing is what is the mud bringing to you? What is the feeling when something you want to happen is not happening, or it's happening in a different way? I've shared this story on here before that when I first moved to New Hampshire, I was planning on buying a completely different practice, a completely different form of technique of chiropractic, knew nothing about what I went on to learn about in the care that I've utilized in my practice for so many years. And yet I knew I was missing something, but it came in a way of an unexpected pregnancy, a divorce, moving away from my friends, and all these things that seemed like uncomfortable things that weren't going my way. But they directed me right into the path. They created the soul neural groove that I needed to put me right where I was supposed to be. But if we are constantly ducking and diving these mud moments, we often never get enough oomph. I think it takes enough mud sometimes to change these neural grooves of stories in which we have so defaulted in our nervous systems, to really allow us to be bumped onto the path, to be bumped onto the path that is your rightful moment to claim, to receive, to have. So these mud moments, how can we practice it? You're seeing cold plunging. If you haven't heard of cold plunging, you should look it up. We're starting to embrace these moments where, what if we're in, and we've talked about this in our stress episode, a moment really of stress, and they call it hermetic stress or eustress, and it's quote unquote the good stress. And cold plunging is something that can put you in a hermetic stress moment where it kind of breaks the pattern. It breaks the pattern in the moment so that you have to come out of the habitual nature that, in how, by the way, and a lot of people have been talking about this week in the office, how exhausting is it to avoid the uncomfortable? How absolutely draining of your energy is it to try to fit into the role that you think you should be, to try to hide your experience or be strong for the kids, or really put on a happy face when really you should be in the swamp, like screaming your biscuits off, or whatever it looks like for you. How exhausting is that for you? It is exhausting because it's not meeting the moment and it's not in rhythm. And it's time to evolve the perspective. And I believe that if we can take these micro moments, and you can just, and it's very easy to recognize, a mud moment it opens a doorway into the gap, just as a microdose of awe. And it's easy to recognize these moments. It's going to be in a moment you don't like. It's going to be a moment you do not like. And it's like taking the wrong exit. And instead of wasting all of your energy being absolutely insanely pissed that you took the wrong exit, that you got stuck in the mud, that that didn't happen the way you wanted to, that this person didn't answer you the way they wanted to? How can you just sink into the moment and know that, in almost like a little twinkle in your eye, and being like, oh, this is what Deb was talking about. Let me see if I can just hang in this little moment. And I trust that hanging with the little moments are going to prevent the 3 alarm fires in your life. And you're going to find that growth becomes less, it becomes more inviting, because it's the thing we all want. We talk about, I just want to be seen, I just want to be understood. And it's the thing we fear. And I believe it's because we don't take the little moments to really sink into the gem that lies in the center of the uncomfortable moment. And so, all that being said, the other part that I wanted to say is that I was thinking I was having this moment alone, the being stuck in the mud, the missing the exit, my moped dying on me. And I woke up this morning, and I usually do yoga in the morning, and I really feel like my body wants to run. So before I was going to go to yoga, I needed to pick up this moped. I needed to see if I could get it to run, or what I was going to do is take the battery out. And so I go and I start it all of a sudden miraculously. So I drive it home, but now I have to get my car. And how do I get my car? I needed to run to my car. So again, like, the universe is really giving us little bumpers. And I think those bumpers are just the little mud moments. And if you didn't have to run away from the mud moment, if you didn't have to fight the moment, if you didn't have to sink and die in the mud moment, what is it there to show you? And know, like the story I was telling you about the client and Crystal's voice, that these are collective human experiences. And the beauty that I've been able to observe and have massive confirmation in, that I get to see people every week, and you see the patterns of how the similar experiences are happening. So as you are engaging differently and inviting these moments as a precursor, like I said, as a moment of reflection that goes, oh God, something good is about to happen. Let me see what this is slowing me down to. Let me see how I can be with this small micro moment. That the more you do that, the more it influences the collective, and the more that the collective is going to evolve into a different reality than having macro doses of anxiety, macro doses of being exhausted, macro doses of being absolutely survival fear infested. And I'm excited about hearing what you have to say. And I would love to hear about your microdoses of mud moments, and how we can begin to participate and be with the little moments that start to transform and grow all these little lotuses in your life. As always, thank you so much for just playing in the circle with me and sharing these experiences. Until next time. And now, Trevor Hall with Blue Sky Mind.
It's in and through